Welcome back, good souls. Welcome back. Last time we saw, the Americans had no other choice but to declare independence. They had been pushed to the point of no return, a place that they couldn't have fathomed just a year or more before. Now here we are after the Declaration of Independence. We are no longer fighting for a revolution. We are no longer fighting for our place within the British Empire. We are now fighting our war for independence. The War of Independence is going to be roughly from the time that the Declaration of Independence is declared, July 4th, 1776. It will last another 5 years until 1781. And the treaty to solidify our independence doesn't even occur until 1783. So once they take that step into independence, it's still a long road ahead of the Americans before they can become truly independent. So the rest of this lecture series will be about that war for independence and the time from the Declaration of Independence all the way until the Treaty of Paris of 1783. So let's take a look at the first major battle after the Declaration of Independence, the Battle of Long Island, which takes place in August of 1776. Now, this battle is not only the first major battle after the Declaration, it is also the largest battle of the entire war, and the first ever battle for the official United States Army. If you go back in Army history, they will consider this their very first official battle as the United States Army. But here on out, we'll still refer to it as the United States Army or the Continental Army or the Continentals, what have you, right? Regulars, that sort of thing. But this is the first official battle for the United States Army. So let's get us up to date here as to what actually happened. How did we get to this point with this battle? So in March of 1776, the British had to retreat out of Boston because of those cannons taken from Fort Ticonderoga. Remember, we talked about those cannons, right? Being taken from Fort Ticonderoga all the way to Boston. Well, eventually they get there in March of 1776, and those cannons are used against the Boston fleet in Boston Harbor, and the British have to take their Boston fleet and retreat them outside of Boston. And they end up going to Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada, right, to kind of regain their bearings, try to refit their ships, because they weren't expecting the colonists to come in with cannons, right? And do you really think that the British are going to leave their best ships sitting in harbor with their best sailors? No, they're not. So when the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga roll in and the colonists start using them, those British sailors freak out. They don't know what's going on. They're just getting bombarded. They don't really know where from. So eventually they have to lift the siege of Boston and leave. And so they leave and go to Canada. So Washington has now successfully taken Boston and reclaimed Boston from the British. He's gotten them to escape to Canada. So Washington is always thinking, okay, well, where are the British going to go next? He doesn't really rest on his victories. So he figures, okay, we retook Boston, we've scattered them to Canada, where's the next possible place they could go? And now he expects a new attack on New York City, because he recognized the strategic importance of New York as the focal point for communications between the northern and the southern colonies, and between the American colonies and the British Canadian colonies. So he realizes that New York State, or New York Colony, and New York City are linchpins for communication, for army movements, for logistics throughout this entire war. So he figures, hey, we just took Boston back, we just took a major port back. Now the British are going to try to go for New York City and claim this strategic area, this strategic port for Britain. So what he does is he has his troops move to Long Island and New York City, right? And when he does, he arrives himself in April of 1776 and reinforces those fortifications that they had built there. Then, a few months later, obviously the Declaration of Independence had been announced to the world, and later in July, British General William Howe, who we saw earlier, established his headquarters in New York City on Staten Island and waited for reinforcement from his brother. His brother is an admiral in the British Navy, and of course his last name is Howe as well. He's Richard Howe, right? So you have the Howe brothers that are trying to figure out how to take New York City, and Washington realizes this. And the Howe brothers had worked really well together throughout their campaigns together. They had been on a few campaigns together before. They worked really well together. And so Britain is thinking they have this unstoppable combination of the Howe brothers, both at land and at sea, that they'll be able to take New York City. So here is what New York City looked like at that time. If you don't know, if you've never been to New York City is not one continuous city. It's a city based on a few islands, actual islands. You see Manhattan there, you see Long Island, you see Staten Island, right? And that's so the city is kind of spread out through all of those islands and through all of those boroughs. So after the Declaration of Independence has been declared, in August of 1776, the British come across Staten Island and land on Long Island. And the British go and attack the American forces. Now, Washington is not with his army at this point. He is off doing other things at this point, which is common in warfare to do this type of thing. It's not like Washington made a mistake or anything like that. It's very common for generals to leave their armies with their second or third in command and go do other type of duties, especially Washington, because he's the general of the entire U.S. Army at this point, and so he has other things to worry about. He has other theaters in the war that he has to worry about. He can't just worry about his army. He has to worry about the entire war effort. So it's very common for him to leave his army behind and go do other things for the other armies throughout America at this point, right? So it's not a mistake. It's not anything that he does. It's a normal thing in the course of warfare, right? So the British come and attack the Americans at their camp there in Long Island, and this is when the Battle of Long Island takes place, is August 22nd, 1776. And this battle takes place in a pass that they call Jamaica Pass in Brooklyn, right, in modern day Brooklyn. And the battle was actually fairly short and very one-sided. The British lost about 63 men that were killed. Another 330 were wounded and missing. While the American army lost about 1,000 men killed or wounded and another 1,000 captured. It's a big difference. Washington's army at that point was only about 8,000 men. So he loses a fourth of his army just right off the bat, either to being dead or being captured. And they hardly make a dent in Howe's forces. So on August 26th, the Americans retreated to a place called Brooklyn Heights. Brooklyn Heights called Brooklyn Heights because it's literally a higher elevated place on the island in the area of Brooklyn. That's why it's called Brooklyn Heights. So any places that you go that have heights in the name, it's literally because of the geography of the surrounding area. It's usually higher than the others. Now people kind of use it to sound more sophisticated, like I live in the heights, right? But whatever, right? So they retreat, and the British could have won an even greater victory if General Howe had heeded the pleas of his officers to storm the American stronghold at Brooklyn Heights. However, General Howe did not run after the Americans and try to storm them at Brooklyn Heights. And the reason why is because General Howe wanted to avoid another Bunker Hill. If you remember from our discussions a little while ago, General Howe was the only British officer that didn't suffer a wound at Bunker Hill. And he saw his men slaughtered because they kept trying to overtake retreating Americans who were retreating in a very organized fashion but were losing. But he saw so many men lose. Remember, we called that a Pyrrhic victory for the British, right? They won the battle, but they lost a lot of men. And General Howe doesn't want that to happen again. That's something that you kind of want from your generals, right? You want them to learn from their mistakes. And General Howe is trying to learn from his mistakes. He saw the resolve that the Americans had at Bunker Hill, and he realizes, hey, if I just keep trying to go after them, I might get a lot of my men killed. Yeah, I may win the battle, but at what cost? But his junior officers were saying, you know, please, sir, let's go after him. We can get him at Brooklyn Heights. We can possibly end this war. This is Washington's army. We could possibly end this war right here and now. But General Howe says no. Instead, we're going to dig in, and he says, bring the cannons in range. So essentially what he wants to do is protect his own men and then just try to essentially siege the Americans there at Brooklyn Heights, try to blast them out, right? Try to take out as many as he can, soften them up before they decide that they're going to go on a full-born assault there on Brooklyn Heights. So you can't really fault General Howe here. He's trying to learn from his mistakes, and he seems to be making a intelligent, strategic move here. Right now, of course, hindsight is always 20/20. You can look back and say, well, if he storms Brooklyn Heights, maybe the British win, maybe the War of Independence ends before it really even starts. But we can't look at it in that fashion. We have to look at what information he has and what information he's trying to learn from, right? So we can't really blame him here for that, or at least the British shouldn't be blaming him for that, right? So, now, the next day, on August 27th, George Washington arrives at Brooklyn Heights and meets his men. And he wasted no time on figuring out who was responsible for the loss in the battle at Jamaica Pass. He doesn't care, right? What's done is done. His men lost. There's no sense in sitting there trying to assess blame, assess who was responsible, or anything. He comes in and says, okay, that's all right, boys. We lost one. That's okay. We need to figure out what our next move is. Right? And that kind of raises the spirits of his men and raises the spirits definitely of his officers, knowing that Washington comes in and says, okay, what's done is done. That's it. Let's move on. Let's figure out how to win this, or at least how to get out of here. Right? So, what he does is he remains very cool, very calm, and very competent in what he's doing. And he oversaw the construction of new fortifications there on Brooklyn Heights. And what happens is that he gets, on the next day, he gets an additional number of troops to boost the number of men under his command to about 9,000. Right? So he gets a good set of reinforcements, but he realizes that he put himself in a trap. He had split his men at one point between Long Island and Manhattan Island, which you can see there on the map, right? You can see that split. Let me point it out here for you, right? He has some men up here in Brooklyn Heights and then some men up here on Manhattan Island. That's not good, right? Because they're split between islands, right? So they're split. He's figuring, ooh, I might be in trouble, right? Can you see why he's thinking they might be in trouble? I'll give you a second to look at the map and see what's going on. What could happen here? What's the trap that he's worried about? What he's worried about is that the British Army can hold him here, right, while the British Navy under Admiral Howe sails up the Hudson, sails up the East River, and cuts him off from his army, and then cuts him off from a route of escape. right? Because remember, these are islands. There's only a finite number of places you can go. So if part of his army is stuck here because the British Navy is in the East River and blocking this army from coming over to help them, or blocking them from retreating to meet up with this army on Manhattan Island, it's divide and conquer at that point for the British. It's only a matter of time, because they can only run in so many places before they run out. So Washington realizes that if the Howe brothers are smart, they're going to cut them off by sailing the British Navy up here and just picking them off one by one. So, and the thing is that the Howe brothers realize Washington's mistake. They realize that they could cut him off too. So they want to try and they want to move in and block Washington from reforming his army. So what happens is when the Howe brothers say, okay, the next day we are going to sail up the rivers, we're going to cut Washington off, and we will just slowly crush the Americans. But there's a saying that comes around about this time that we will see applied again throughout American history. And the saying goes, God watches out for fools, drunks, and the United States of America. And this is one of those cases where that happens. Because the next day, an apocalyptic storm just forms right in this area in New York City. Now, they had weather reports and things back then. Like, they could figure out the weather. I mean, granted, it's not the near sophistication that we do today with GPS and all of that kind of stuff, right? And all these crazy satellites and everything. But they could figure out weather reports. Nowhere in either side's weather reports did they think, okay, we're going to have a torrential downpour and, end of the world type rains. And this storm just pops up over New York, and there's torrential rain, there's unfavorable winds. It's a loud storm, it's a violent storm. Well, this storm, with its unfavorable winds, keeps the British Navy and Admiral Howe there in New York Bay. They cannot sail up the rivers. It's impossible. So they lose the advantage of trying to take opportunity to cut Washington off. Washington realizes his position was untenable and that it's time to withdraw. This is the time to withdraw, is at a point when the Navy can't sail up, and with the violence of the storm, they can move across silently and not be detected. So, Washington's troops on the night of August 29th noiselessly crossed the East River into Manhattan. Darkness, fog, and that apocalyptic thunderstorm immobilized Admiral Howe's fleet. Washington's cool and firm command exacted superb discipline from his young troops. He had kept the British high command in utter ignorance of the evacuation that he hastily ordered. This wasn't a planned out thing. Like, he didn't know the rain was coming, but he realized, I have to take advantage of what has been given to me here. So the next day, bright, shiny skies, the storm is gone. Poof, whoop, storm's gone as quickly as it came. Admiral Howe thinks, well, all right, okay, so we got delayed a day. No big deal. So they move in to charge Brooklyn Heights. And when the British charged that next morning, they charged up the heights and found nothing. They found empty trenches. How'd you like to be one of those British soldiers, George! And you run up there, and then you're like, I got you. Sir, they're not here. What? They're not here. Where the hell did they go? I don't know. Right? So, even though they had lost the battle, Washington's withdrawal earned him praise from both Americans and the British. Even the Howe brothers were like, wow, well done. Okay, good on you. Good on you, Washington. You pulled one over on us. That's a good piece of strategic and tactical moving when your enemies are like, well, all right, you got us. Okay. So eventually, Washington is going to move his men off of Manhattan Island. If you're wondering, well, why didn't they just sail up and surround him on Manhattan Island? Washington moves his men up and out of Manhattan eventually, right? And so the Howe brothers lose their advantage there. He's reformed his army. They are all together. So the opportunity there for the Howe brothers to essentially divide and conquer is now gone. So, well, what happens here after the battle? Well, on September 11th, 1776, the British received a delegation from the Americans consisting of 3 men: Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and a man that will become a prominent American politician later, a man by the name of Edward Rutledge. So you have Franklin, John Adams, and Edward Rutledge go over and be a delegation for the Americans to the British. And it's supposed to be a peace conference. They're supposed to talk about peace and how we can subtly or quickly end this war. Well, the peace conference failed. The reason why it failed is because before they would even meet, the British said, you have to revoke the Declaration of Independence. You have to take it back. You can't say that you're independent of us right now if you want us to talk to you. Well, who are they talking to? They're talking to the guy who wrote the damn thing. Do you think Ben Franklin, of all people, from what we've talked about Ben Franklin, do you think that he's going to be like, well, okay, yeah, I'll take it back? Yeah, no. No. The one guy in 1775 who was like, hey, we need independence. That guy, you think he's going to take back that declaration? Not a chance. So, when they put that forth, Franklin said, no, we're gone. See ya. They left. The Americans knew what they had, and the British didn't really understand. They thought that that declaration was just, I guess a scare tactic or something, but they didn't really know who they were talking to. I guess they didn't really know their audience there with old Ben Franklin. Then a few days later, on September 21st, a fire erupted in New York City. And it destroyed a quarter of the city. This quarter of the city gets burned to the ground. Remember when we talked about with the Boston Massacre and fires within close quarters, right? And how quickly they can spread. Well, here's what you see, right? It didn't happen in Boston that one time, but here in New York City it does. Think about a quarter of New York City being burned down, right? That's insane. But on that same day when this fire broke out, the British are able to find a prominent member of Washington's spy ring. And they capture a man by the name of Nathan Hale. Nathan Hale is one of Washington's spies in his spy ring and very prominent in New York. And of course, for spying on the British, General Howe orders Nathan Hale to be hanged. And Hale is famous for having his last words be, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." And after he says that, the hangman loosens the trapdoor on the gallows, and Nathan Hale is hanged. He is not hung. Only Mrs. Hale knows if he was hung. He was hanged. All right? Some of you may get that, some of you may not. If you don't get it, well, don't worry about it. So that's where we're sitting at now, right? Washington retreats, but he lives to fight another day. Let me ask you this. How many battles do you think George Washington won? We already see a loss here, so he didn't win here. How many do you think he won? Like personally, with his own army. Obviously, we're not talking about the entirety of the Continental Army, the U.S. Army, right? We're not talking about that, because you can say, well, he won and lost all the battles at that point. But his own personal army, I'll give you a clue. He fought 9. We give him credit for 9 battles with his army. Go ahead, take a guess. Some of you probably said none. We wouldn't be here if it was none. So hopefully none of you said none. 3. 3 is all he won. 3 out of 9. Now, if he's a baseball player, that's a Hall of Fame average right there. 333. That puts you in the Hall of Fame easy. But when it comes to military, you're probably losing wars with that win percentage. The reason why he not only doesn't lose the war but wins it is because in those 6 losses, he knows when he needs to get out. He knows that living to fight another day is better than dying there for glory or country or whatever. He realizes in this war, it's better to live to fight another day. And you can see how he masterfully took his men from a very precarious situation that he himself put him in, and he realized it. But he also realized his mistake and got him out of there, right? To the praise of everyone, including his enemies, right? So that's what makes Washington such a great general and such a man for the job, is because he understands that he's fighting professional soldiers with farmers and some irregularly trained guys, and that's it. And he realizes this. So he realizes living to fight another day is better than just sitting there and dying. And that's what makes him such a great general and what a military genius, according to some people. So, now I just went on this big spiel about how Washington had 3 wins and 9 tries. Well, we're going to talk about one of those wins right here. This is the Battle of Trenton. If you don't know where Trenton is, it's in New Jersey. This battle takes place on Christmas night into December 26th of 1776. It was one of the shortest battles of the entire war. So we go from one of the largest battles to one of the shortest battles. So why are we even talking about it? If it's the shortest battle of the war, why aren't we even talking about it? Well, we're talking about it because of what happens in the battle itself and what it means not only to Washington's army, but to the country as a whole. Now, at this point, Trenton is occupied by around 1,400 Hessians. And you see it spelled there for you on the screen, with Hessians. Now, Hessians are German mercenaries from the German Principality of Hesse. That's why they're Hessians. And the Hessians were known as some of the best mercenary fighters in the world at this point, especially in Europe. And so the fact that the British are trying to hire Hessians to come over, one, they're trying to save their own men. That's why you use mercenaries. But if you want to try to instill fear in another group of people, you will use mercenary groups, especially ones with a great reputation like the Hessians. So the Hessians, you can see what the Hessians look like there on the left, right? That's kind of what their uniforms look like at the time, right? And the use of them was a signal to the Americans that the British were now serious, that we are going to hire these world-renowned mercenaries to try to come and kill you, right? Now, so it's Christmas, right? And there's an old story that says that the Hessians, being Germans, were sitting there getting drunk and being merry there on Christmas Eve or on Christmas night, and singing carols and all this kind of stuff, and that helps the American effort here. Well, we don't have any evidence of that. We don't have any evidence that the Hessians were, fall down drunk and all this kind of stuff, right? I mean, it was Christmas, so sure, they were probably celebrating, and they were probably celebrating with a little bit of alcohol, like, Germans celebrate anything with alcohol, right? So, but we have no idea if they were actually truly just, all 1,400 of them were plastered and stumbling around drunk. There's no evidence of that, and most likely it's just not true. Now, the Americans were aided because Washington, again with his spies, has a spy with the Hessians. And what happens here is the spy gathers intelligence there in Trenton and then misled the Hessian defenders. What the spy does is he estimated the strength of the Hessian defenders and then convinced them that the Americans were in no condition to attack them there at Trenton. No condition whatsoever. He said, look, I mean, it's right after this Battle of Long Island. Washington's running around the countryside confused, just trying to get away from the Howe brothers. They're in no condition to fight. It's winter, and it's Christmas. It's Christmas. Who attacks somebody on Christmas? Like, nobody will attack you on Christmas and try to kill you on Christmas, right? Wrong. The United States will, right? But that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to convince them. And the way he tries to convince them is he says, look, because it's Christmas, the weather is bad, because there's a massive blizzard going on at this point. And he's saying, look, they're not coming. They're not coming. And what the Hessians would do is that every night they would send a patrol down there onto the Delaware River, right? And they would send this patrol along the Delaware to make sure that the Americans weren't trying to cross, right? So every night they would run this patrol down and then retreat back into Trenton. Well, the spy convinces them, hey, the blizzard, it's Christmas, they're not coming, they're confused, don't worry about it. So he convinces the Hessians not to send out the patrol that night. And then he gets word to Washington, they're not sending a patrol out this night. If you want to cross the Delaware and come in here, now is the time to do it. So, what happens is that Washington then crosses the Delaware, which you can see up in this little map here, right? I mean, Trenton's down here. And he can't just cross like right at Trenton. That would give him away. So he comes way up the river and crosses here, right? Something known as McConkey's Ferry, right? They cross McConkey's Ferry, and then they march south to Trenton. Eventually, Washington splits his men up into a northern group and a southern group, and they're going to essentially come around to Trenton and meet in the middle, right? And smash the Hessians on either side. Well, they're able to reach across the Delaware River at 3 a.m. on Christmas night or the morning of December 26th. And through the raging snowstorm, they march for the next 5 hours through there to get to Trenton. They get to Trenton at 8 o'clock that morning. And the battle starts at 8 o'clock and it's over by 9, with the Americans crushing the Hessians. And this is how bad they got crushed. The Hessians lost 23 men killed outright, which you're thinking, okay, out of 1,400, that's not that big a deal. But a whopping 900 were captured. 900. Right? So only about 500, 400 of them get away. The Americans only suffered 5 deaths. That's it. And no deaths from any Hessian gun. All 5 of those American deaths were due to hypothermia from marching through the snow. So how would you like to be one of those 5 guys? You don't get shot, but you die of hypothermia. Only 2 Americans were even wounded. And those 2, one was a man by the name of Captain William Washington. And yes, he was related to George Washington. He was George Washington's younger cousin. So George Washington at, family gatherings after that heard no end of that from his aunt. You got little Willie injured on campaign, right? I mean, I know if I got one of my cousins hurt on a campaign, my aunts and uncles would never let me live that down, no matter who I was, right? And the other person to get wounded was a young lieutenant named James Monroe, the future president of the United States. And James Monroe got shot through the ankle bone. I thought probably some of you are sitting there going, "Oh, God, could you imagine?" Like, think about, like if any of you hit your ankle on the side of a table or something, right? It doesn't feel very good. Well, think about getting a musket ball from a musket or a pistol shot through that bone. Apparently, for a long time, James Monroe had a limp afterward that the other founding fathers made fun of him for. So they're like, you're the only one to get shot at Trenton. He was like, shut up. So even being a founding father and a president doesn't mean that you're not going to get shit from your friends later on, right? So, but those are the only 2 wounded. That's it. No American deaths except from hypothermia, right? And more than likely, like, you're thinking, how did they capture 900 of them like that? Well, most of them they probably caught because they were still asleep or just hanging out around their tent in the morning, right? They weren't prepared. They didn't know that Washington was coming until it was too late. The ones that could put up a fight were typically in the middle of the camp, and they realized what was going on and just fled. The ones on the outskirts of the camps, they're the ones who got captured. I mean, how would you like to wake up one morning, if you're a Hessian, and some, colonial American is poking you in the face with his musket going, hey, wake up. You're captured. You're like, what? Right? And that's how a lot of them were captured. So, now the reason why we talked about this is because this battle gave everyone a boost of confidence. Everyone. The Continental Congress has new confidence in the Army and what they're doing because it proved that the American forces could defeat not only regular soldiers, and what we mean by regulars is professionals, right? Not only could they defeat regulars, they could defeat German mercenaries. Wow! Hey! Now, does it matter that they captured them while half of them were asleep? No. Let's not talk about that. Right? But it shows that they could defeat them. They could hold their own against those types. So they start giving Washington, trying to give him a little bit more money, a little bit more support to try to get things going. It also increased re-enlistments into the Continental Army, into the U.S. Army. So all these guys that were hitting the end of their year term, because that's what a lot of them did, right? They were there for a year. They would sign a year contract to serve, and it usually started January 1st and ended December 31st. So a lot of those guys were coming up for renewal, or they could leave. And a lot of them re-enlisted after this victory. Even soldiers that weren't at Trenton but heard about this victory over the Hessians, they agreed, like, yeah, we need to stay in. We can actually win this war. And then, of course, it also increased new enlistments into the Army because they're thinking, hey, wow, we just beat some Germans and we must be doing pretty good. So overall, it just gave everybody this boost of confidence and really raised morale. And you can't underestimate those types of things in war. You can't underestimate morale and what confidence will do for people at war and for an army at war. It's a big deal for a lot of people. And so that's why this victory is so important. In fact, the British are going to bring up this victory later on as well as a shining example of what Washington can do with his army, right? And here is Washington taking the surrender of some of the Hessians there. At least that's the painting of it, right? Of him in the aftermath taking the surrender of the Hessians. I don't know why they haven't picked up dead bodies yet, but I guess that's just artistic license there, right? But then out of this battle comes another famous painting, right? And it's this, right? Most of you have probably seen this or at least know what it is, right? It's called Washington Crossing the Delaware. Now, from what I just told you, let's play the little elementary game. What's wrong with this picture? Go ahead, I'll give you a minute to look. Figure out, okay, what's wrong with this picture? If you said, it's at the wrong time of day, you would be correct. I don't really think at 3 a.m. in the dead of winter it's that bright outside, right? With the sun shining through the clouds. So that's definitely not correct. What else? Now some of you may be thinking, well, do they have horses? Why are they bringing horses? They didn't have horses. That's actually accurate. They did bring their horses across on the boats, right? I will say that there more than likely there's not these giant icebergs out in the Delaware River, right? I mean, these are huge. Now, granted, I've never seen the Delaware River in the winter, so I could be wrong, but I don't really think the river does that at this point. Also, Washington, what's wrong with this? You may be thinking, I don't know what, Dr. Smith, I don't get it. Do you really think it's smart for the general of the entire army to be standing at the front of a boat like Captain Morgan? No. No. That's just begging, hey, shoot me in the head. Right? Generals typically don't do that. They don't like to wear a giant target, right? And say, hey, shoot me in the head. He's probably back here sitting with his men who are all freezing their balls off going, why are we up at 3 in the morning crossing this near frozen river in a blizzard, right? And Washington's probably sitting in the back shivering going, I'm wondering the same thing, right? So, now this is one of the most famous paintings in American history. It is up, I believe, either in Washington, D.C. or in the New York Metropolitan Art Museum. It's in one of the two. Right? And it's huge. This painting is enormous. And I'm not talking about popularity. I'm talking about size. Right? It's wall size. It's almost mural size. I mean, it is a large painting. And people are like, oh, look at the majesty there. I mean, that looks American, right? America! Washington crossing the Delaware. Yeah! Ready to go kick some ass. And it's totally not true. Right? None of this. None of this is, like, this whole thing is just fairly inaccurate, right? But that should tell you, like, artists aren't history majors, right? They're just painting this because, hey, he crossed the Delaware at one point. It must have been the most American river crossing in the history of ever, right? So, it's just one of those things that I find funny. Then we come to the Saratoga campaign of 1777, which takes place during September and October of 1777. The Saratoga campaign involved a lot of moving parts, especially from the British, and the battles around Saratoga, actually, there's about 3 battles. Well, there's 2 battles and a siege that happened during the Saratoga campaign. So, the British strategy for this was actually a British offensive strategy that they took on to try to wrestle the New York away from the colonists, and the plan was to sever the ties between the New England colonies and the southern colonies by taking the main middle colony, namely New York. Okay, so the British general that comes up with this plan is actually not General Howe. It is a man by the name of Johnny Burgoyne, and he was known as Gentleman Johnny, right? And Johnny Burgoyne goes to the high command, not in America, but in England. And he goes to them and he says, look, we failed in 1776 to end this stupid rebellion. I have a plan that I believe can end the rebellion. So he talks to the British high command there in England. He gets sent back to America in 1777. And essentially what he wants to do is he will lead some men down from Canada, essentially the same route that the Americans took from America to Canada. He's going to take from Canada to America and go to Fort Ticonderoga. And then from there, he's going to march to Albany and try to take Albany, where an American garrison is placed. But to do this, he obviously needs some help. And so the plan was for Gentleman Johnny, who you there see on the British flag there on the left, he's supposed to get help from William Howe, who is supposed to send about 10,000 men up from New York City to Albany to meet him, and the guy that you see in the lower right corner, Barry St. Ledger. Barry St. Ledger is supposed to come from another portion of Canada and come help Gentleman Johnny finish off the Americans there in Saratoga and around in Albany. And the idea again is to separate the New England colonies from the Southern colonies, cut lines of communication, lines of supplies, things of that nature. He never really said how he's going to do this by taking this swath of land, but he just says this is what's going to happen. He showed him on a map, and he basically drew a line across the map and said, see, we can cut it. So that's what the British go with. Now, he's hoping that with the control of upstate New York, that the Americans are essentially going to wither away and die because they can't communicate with one another. I guess he doesn't think that boats don't exist or something, right? But that's how he sells it to the British High Command. British High Command approve it, send him back. So he marches down from Canada through the Champlain Valley that we talked about, and he actually kicks the Americans out of Fort Ticonderoga and takes Fort Ticonderoga. And he's told that Barry St. Ledger is on his way and that Howe is going to send troops. Now, historians kind of argue about this now, about whether Howe was really supposed to send troops or not, or whether he agreed to it or not. And it's a point of contention between historians because both sides have a pretty good evidence that their side is correct. It seems that the British High Command thought that William Howe was going to send troops. It seemed like Johnny Burgoyne thought William Howe was going to send troops, but we're not necessarily sure if actually William Howe agreed to send troops or not. So that's where a point of contention, where if you read about the Saratoga campaign further, you're going to find some contention between historians as to what exactly was agreed upon for this campaign and what general agreed to do what and how and all this kind of stuff, right? So it's still something that historians argue about today. But we're going, for our purposes, we're going to assume that Johnny Burgoyne is going to get help from William Howe, or at least he believes he's going to get help from William Howe. So, William Howe is supposed to send about 10,000 troops, and maybe he's going to come, maybe he's going to send his second in command, but Burgoyne thinks he's going to get Southern help from William Howe's group coming up from New York City. So, and he wants them to meet eventually around Saratoga, right? And it is a devil of a time trying to find a good map of Saratoga, but we had to kind of piece them together. So, here's New York Colony, New York State, right? And here's the county where all this takes place, right? And then here's a breakdown of the county here. You see there's Saratoga right here, right? And the battles kind of take place all along in here. But normally if you try to Google Saratoga, it shows you Saratoga Springs and not Saratoga itself, right? So this is where all of this is going to take place, right? So, now, apparently, William Howe agrees to do this, right? Or at least that's what we're going to assume. But then he immediately makes the decision, I don't really want to do that. Instead, I want to go capture Philadelphia. I think there's a lot of loyalist sentiment there in Philadelphia and New Jersey, in that area of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So I'm going to go take Philadelphia, because I think I can end the war by taking Philadelphia, because the Continental Congress is in Philadelphia. If I capture the Congress, then the war's over, right? I guess he thinks this is a game of Risk or something, or capital taking, where you just take the capital and the war is over, right? But could you imagine Americans giving up if some invading force took Washington, D.C. now and said, well, war's over, we took your capital? Most Americans would be like, no, come get us, right? But that's kind of old-style European war-making type of theories going on. So, Howe marches to Philadelphia. And then you'd think, right, you know, New Jersey's here, Philadelphia is going to be down here, right? You'd think that William Howe would just march across, right? That would seem like the smart move. Just march across, and in that case, if these guys up here need help, he can just about face and go forward, right? But instead, William Howe loads up on his brother's boats there in New York, gets on Admiral Howe's boats, and goes a long way around. So he goes to sea. Well, the problem is if your subordinate generals have problems, you can't get to them because your whole army is out to sea. And it takes them like a month to get from New York down to Philadelphia and around. It's a ridiculous amount of time. I guess they thought they were on a pleasure cruise or something, right? So, Howe is now taken out of the equation, right? So, we start with these three, and then whoop, there goes General Howe. Now, as a side note, General Howe does take Philadelphia. Rather easily, I might add. He takes it with almost no problems. The thing is, though, is he didn't capture the Continental Congress. The Continental Congress hears that he's coming because he spent a month out at sea, and they're like, hey, where did Howe's army go? And somebody says, oh, I think we saw some English ships coming this way. And they thought, okay, well, he's probably coming here. We should probably leave. And so they did. They went to a place called York, Pennsylvania. Right? So that's where the Continental Congress goes whenever Howe marches into Philadelphia. He takes it, and they're like, where's the Continental Congress? They're like, I don't know. We have no idea. Right? So now the British are in Philadelphia. Howe's taken it, but he's left his men out there in Albany area, Saratoga area, with no support. And none of that support is coming. Because by the time Johnny Burgoyne hears about this, it's too late. And Howe can't do anything about it. And neither can Burgoyne. So, then we come to old Barry St. Ledger there. Now, Barry St. Ledger was supposed to come down from Canada, and he was bringing about 1,000 or so men and another 600 to 1,000 Indian allies, mostly Iroquois. By the way, the Iroquois fight on both sides of the war. I guess the Iroquois Confederacy was divided on who was going to win the war. Some Iroquois, or members of the Iroquois Confederacy fight for the British. Other members of the Iroquois Confederacy fight for the Americans. So he's coming down, and they're coming down the Mohawk River Valley, and they get stopped by a large American militia. It's not even regulars. It's just a group of militia. And the militiamen actually stop St. Ledger's advance down the river valley into New York. They stop it. And then Benedict Arnold is actually out there, and Benedict Arnold comes out and essentially fakes out Barry St. Ledger by making him think he has this enormous force that he's going to attack St. Ledger with. Well, St. Ledger's Indian leaders are like, nope, we're not doing that. And they leave. And they take supplies, they take men, they take all this stuff with them. And so Barry St. Ledger's like, well, I'm not marching down there anymore. There's no way. This is going to be a slaughter. And so he marches back to Canada. So, whoop. Now, a three-pronged attack is now down to one prong. And the thing is that Gentleman Johnny is out there wondering, hey, where did everybody go? Because he doesn't hear about Howe till it's too late. He's wondering where St. Ledger is, because Ledger didn't send any word. So he's just kind of hanging out there. And he doesn't really know what kind of precarious situation he's sitting in. So, what happens here is that the person who really figures out Burgoyne's situation before anybody else is George Washington. That's pretty bad if you're the British and your enemy knows your situation before you do. And Washington, when he learns of Burgoyne's tenuous situation, he wrote a letter to all of the militia and the regulars in New England. And in the letter he says, "Let all of New England rise and crush Burgoyne." Ooh. So he sends General Horatio Gates, he sends Benjamin Lincoln, he sends Daniel Morgan, and he sends Benedict Arnold to go crush Burgoyne. Whoops. There we go. There's old Horatio, there's Benedict, there's Dan Morgan, and there's Benjamin Lincoln. So now, Gentleman Johnny is up a creek. Let's put it that way. But Johnny Burgoyne believes that he is the superior commander to these upstart Americans, and he believes that he doesn't need the help. Him and his between 7,500 and 9,000 soldiers, they're regulars, they can defeat this ragtag bunch of rebels. So, he marches down to Saratoga, and the Americans and the English make camp within eyesight of each other. They go to places known as Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights. And these battles get extremely complicated with a lot of back and forth between the two. But the first battle of Saratoga, also known as the Battle of Freeman's Farm, takes place in September of 1777. Now, what happens is that Burgoyne tries to advance to an American position. Right? The Americans have moved up. You can see here, Burgoyne sends his men from base camp, right? And they have a battle there at Freeman's Farm. And the battle goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, till eventually the Americans are able to repulse the British back to their camp. So, the Americans win the field. They halt Burgoyne's advancement. And Burgoyne is sitting there going, okay, well, I'll just keep waiting for my reinforcements. They have to be coming soon, right? So for the next 3 or so weeks, both sides just sit there and look at each other. Now you may be thinking, why? Why do they do this? Just the way war was back then. It wasn't a constant attack all the time, like we tend to think modern warfare is. But even modern warfare has its ebbs and flows as well, right? So they kind of sit there and, both are kind of waiting for reinforcements, and Burgoyne is going, where the hell are the other guys? Till finally, on October 7th, Burgoyne sends another group out. The Second Battle of Saratoga, also known as the Battle of Bemis Heights. Right? So Burgoyne sends another group out, about 1,500, to go test this American line out here at Bemis Heights. Right? And again, the Americans are able to repulse the British. And it's during this battle that Benedict Arnold leads an attack on a British, what we call redoubt, but it's essentially a dugout type of fortified area, right? It's not quite a trench, but it's kind of a made ridge type area, right? He leads this attack, and he's successful. Benedict Arnold is successful, and it helps drive the British from the field. But Benedict Arnold is also shot through the leg. It takes his horse down. He goes through his leg. He has a severely injured leg, and he's pulled off the battlefield. And he apparently he still wanted to stay on the battlefield. Apparently he was like, it's just a flesh wound, right? But they pull him off the field. And who goes in his place? Horatio Gates. Horatio Gates, who was the leader of this whole thing, takes his place and leads the charge and drives the British from the field. Burgoyne is now at this point realizes, well, I am definitely not getting any help now. So the fighting on that second battle, the Battle of Bemis Heights, ends because of darkness. They couldn't see anymore. So that night, Burgoyne realizes that he's suffered about 1,000 casualties, and the Americans have suffered maybe half that, tops. So under the cover of darkness, he left all of his campfires burning to make the Americans think that the English were still there, and he withdrew from the battlefield, from his camp, and eventually he retreats to fortifications at Saratoga, New York. Well, the Americans quickly figure out what's going on, and so they rush to Saratoga to make sure that Burgoyne can't fortify the city anymore, and that they're going to try to cut off his supply lines and his communication lines. So they get to Saratoga, and they surround that British force, which is now at about 6,000, whereas now the Americans, their combined number is about 20,000. So these 20,000 Americans surround Saratoga and essentially lay siege to it, but not a siege like we like to think, right? They essentially just cut it off and wait. Now, Burgoyne realizes, okay, now I'm surrounded, I'm outnumbered over 3-1, all my supply lines are cut, my communication lines are cut, we need to do something about it. So following his retreat to Saratoga, he immediately starts negotiations for terms of surrender with Horatio Gates. Then finally, on October 17th, 1777, Gentleman Johnny formally surrenders. Now, under the very generous terms of the Convention of Saratoga, Burgoyne is allowed to march out of camp with, and this is quoting the convention here, with the honors of war. Which essentially means he got to keep his colors, which is, his flags and his standards and things like that. And the term said that his men could return to England. Right? So they don't even get put into camps, really. Right? They're not taken prisoner. Right? So they essentially treat him like a gentleman. Right? And say, just go home. So his 6,000 men marched out of their camp, and they surrendered their weapons, and they begin to head west. However, when they reached New England, Gates's terms were not honored, and the British soldiers spent a few months in sparsely guarded camps, and then they just kind of leave. Right? So it wasn't really helpful there. Right? But this is a big victory for the Americans. It's a huge victory. The reason why it's a huge victory is not for winning the battle, which, granted, it was big, right? They still lost Fort Ticonderoga, but they kicked Johnny Burgoyne out. They kept Barry St. Ledger from coming down. Granted, they also lost Philadelphia during this time period. So why is it such a big deal? The big deal is what happens after the battle. General Horatio Gates becomes known as the hero of Saratoga, which, how do you think Benedict Arnold feels about that? He's the one who led the charge. He's the one who got injured. It was Gates that essentially came in and mopped up. But Gates is known as the hero of Saratoga, not Benedict Arnold. Keep that in mind. The victory there at Saratoga also gave America a much needed momentum boost. And the victory here at Saratoga is called the diplomatic victory. All right, the diplomatic victory. It's called the diplomatic victory because it allowed for the French to finally sign a formal alliance with the United States. Now, you can probably guess who negotiated this deal with the French. That would be Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin is in Paris at the time. He's acting as our negotiator and our ambassador to France. Now, Franklin hears about the victory at Saratoga, and he immediately goes to the French government, and he says, look, the British just lost this battle. It came from British High Command in England to do this, and the Americans stopped them. But now the British are saying, hey, we'll take you back. We'll treat you like you want to be treated. We'll treat you like the Englishman that you are. And Franklin says, this is really appealing to a lot of my countrymen. They are really considering going back to England and just essentially going back to the way things were. Now, France, if you don't want that to happen, you should probably make it to where, we don't have the incentive to do that. So maybe you should give us some supplies. Maybe you should give us some men. Maybe you should give us some generals. Maybe you should give us some money. Right? Now, of course, the French don't want America to go back to England at all. Right? That's just going to fortify England even further. Right? And now the British would have an excuse because the French had already kind of started helping the Americans anyway, but not in any sort of formal way. But The French think, well, the Americans aren't going to keep their mouth shut, and what if England decides to declare war on us after this because we tried to help America get its independence? So the French are freaking out, and they're like, yeah, sure, whatever you need. Here, just take it all. Take all the monies, take all the soldiers, take all the supplies, whatever you need. So they sign this formal agreement, and essentially says that France will help America win its independence by supplying all these things, and that America and France will be BFFs forever and ever. Best friends forever and ever and ever, the end. Right? Now, do you think that's going to last? Nope. But that's what the thing says. Right? So they sign this formal alliance, and at the beginning of 1778 is when we really start to see this permanent military alliance really start to come forth, right? And so they start sending these things over, right, at the beginning of 1778. So it allows for America to really get some more international help on a more official level, right? That's why it's the diplomatic victory, is because it allows for all of these diplomatic relations to happen with France. Also, an interesting note, you see Yankee Doodle listed there. And what happens is, hopefully you've heard the song Yankee Doodle Dandy, right? And the Americans actually played Yankee Doodle Dandy whenever Johnny Burgoyne's men are being led out of camp, right? Whenever they're walking out of camp and surrendering their weapons, the Americans are playing Yankee Doodle Dandy, right? If you don't know it, or maybe you haven't, it's been a while, you know, it's Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni, right? Now, when you're kids and you learn that in American school systems, it doesn't make any sense, right? You just sing it because it's got a nice little tune, right? But how does him sticking a feather in his cap, why did he call it macaroni? Like, have you ever worried or wondered why he called it macaroni? Or what the hell does Yankee Doodle mean? Right? Well, let me tell you. This is what Yankee Doodle means. Now, there's a lot of theories about what Yankee Doodle means, and a lot of people will kind of sugarcoat this for you and not try to tell you what the real meaning of it is, or they'll try to get around what the real meaning of it means. But you got to remember, history is not always nice and neat. It's, you know, it can be crude. It can be, let's just put it, it can be crude at times, right? So Yankee Doodle Dandy, right? What does that mean, right? Well, Yankee is kind of a bastardization of a Dutch word, Jock, right? Or yuck, right? Essentially, that means an idiot, right? Somebody who's slow, a moron, right? Somebody who's not all quite there, right? The Yankee Doodle essentially means like somebody who's really stupid, right? That's kind of what, like, doodle comes from another thing called like dawdle or something in Dutch, right? And so a Yankee Doodle is somebody that is really stupid, right? And there's arguments over exactly what doodle means or where it came from, but that's essentially what we think it means. So Yankee Doodle means somebody who's really stupid, right? Now, dandy at the time in England meant somebody who they described as foppish, right? And foppish just meant somebody who, or specifically a male who was into high fashion, into fine foods, into dance. Essentially, they used it as slang, dandy as slang, for homosexuals, right? So Yankee Doodle Dandy is actually set to an old English tune, an old English drinking tune, right? Some people say it's an Irish tune too, but either way, right? And it was actually invented by the British first, right? Now, okay, so Yankee Doodle Dandy, so they're essentially calling us really stupid homosexuals, or really, like, they're just calling us gay idiots, is essentially what they're calling us, right? Then, okay, stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni, right? Well, at the time in England, in London, there was this very famous club called the Macaroni Club. The Macaroni Club was where these foppish dandies would go and discuss politics and literature and fashion and clothing and food and all this kind of stuff, right? It's a very high class club, right? And so what it's making fun of is that we're so stupid that we can just stick a feather in our hat and think that we're high fashion like those foppish dandies in the Macaroni Club. That we think that we're so stupid that if we stick a feather in our hat, we think that's really like high fashion and that we know what we're talking about, right? So they're saying these gay idiots are so stupid that they think that they can stick a feather in their hat and they're high fashion and they're high class all of a sudden and that they're intelligent, and they're not, right? That's what the song means. That's what the chorus means, right? But do we know in America, do we know anything about, being a dandy or being foppish or what a macaroni club is? No. But we know a good tune when we hear one. And they're like, Yankee Doodle, and it sounds patriotic. Yankee Doodle Dandy. Well, yeah, I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy. Hooray. Right? And so we adopt it as one of our own, and we take it. That's why it's a popular patriotic song. It's because we just knew a good tune when we heard one. We didn't know what it meant. Right? And now it's kind of changed around. Right? I mean, now the New York Yankees, right? That's seen as an American phrase, right? Now we use Yankee as a phrase for a Northerner, right? And so the word has changed over time, right? Dandy eventually becomes like, hey, that's dandy. It's fine. It's okay. It's whatever, right? It's really dandy, right? But that doesn't change until the 1900s, because we'll even see later on some American politicians are described as dandies, right? And so we'll talk about that too, right? So we really didn't know what it meant, but we just knew a good tune. So that's where we get Yankee Doodle from, and that's why it's still around in American culture, is because it's seen as the quintessential American patriotic song. And to us it is, right? And the meaning of it has become lost, and now the meaning is a very patriotic American revolutionary song. It's kind of funny how all that kind of stuff works out, right? Okay, so now after we had a little fun there with old Yankee Doodle, let's get to something a little bit more serious. It's not quite near as fun as learning about American folk songs, essentially. So, winter of 1777-1778, winter's coming in. Prospects for future campaigning were greatly diminished, and Washington is now seeking quarters for his men. He elects Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, which is about 22 miles northwest of Philadelphia, right? So you can see here's Valley Forge here on the map. Here's Philadelphia, right? And remember, who's in Philadelphia? Right, the British, right? And out here is York, Pennsylvania. It's not here on the map, but it's kind of out here, right? The reason why Washington picks Valley Forge is because it's close enough to York to help protect the Continental Congress, right, from any sort of attack that may come from Philadelphia. But it's also close enough that if the English decide to forage out in the Pennsylvania wilderness for food or supplies or anything like that, the American forces can try to stop them from doing that, right? So it's close enough to keep the British at bay, but far enough to protect the Continental Congress there at York. So, December 19th, 1777, Washington's poorly fed, ill-equipped, weary from long marches army struggled into Valley Forge. When they get there, the cold winter winds blew as the 12,000 Continentals prepared for winter's fury. Within days of the army's arrival, the river there froze over. That's how cold it was. Snow was 6 to 10 feet deep. And And through the winter there, they started a construction of more than 1,000 huts to provide shelter. But it did little to offset the critical shortages that were continually plaguing the army. So think about that. There's 1,000 huts. That sounds like a lot, but that's 12 men per hut. Right? 12 men per hut. What do you think is going to happen when you have that many men crammed into these little huts? If you said disease, you are a winner. Right? Disease starts to run through the camp there at Valley Forge. And about 2,000 men die from disease because of their cramped quarters there in those huts. So think about it. You had a 1 in 6 chance of dying from disease during this winter, right? And that's going to take a hit on your morale, right? If you're in there with 12 guys and 2 of them die, that's gonna take a toll on you mentally, and then you can't do anything about it except just sit there and freeze, right? So that's going to take a toll on them. What else takes a toll on them is the soldiers received irregular supplies of meat and bread, and some of them only got their nourishments from something called fire cake, which fire cake was essentially flour and water thrown onto the fire and cooked. It's like a really hard biscuit, right? And what it does is, because of the texture, because of how it's cooked and everything, it's just really hard on not only to eat, but it's difficult on your system too. It could rip up your stomach. Apparently these soldiers that survived Valley Forge, they would have intestinal problems, gut problems for a long time. Some of them for the rest of their life, because of having to eat strictly fire cake for so long, right? 5-6 months of just eating fire cake. And it's really bad for you, but it's the only thing that can fill you up and give you any sort of nourishment at best, right? So the conditions were so severe at times that Washington despaired, and he wrote to the Continental Congress that unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place, this army must inevitably starve, dissolve, or disperse in order to obtain subsistence in the best manner they can. Animals fared no better. Hundreds of horses either starved to death or died of exhaustion. Though Washington repeatedly petitioned for relief, Congress was unable to provide it, and the soldiers continued to suffer. Now, they got a little bit of relief when women and relatives of the enlisted men alleviated some of their suffering by providing valuable services to them. Things like laundry, nursing, cooking what they could, right, that the army desperately needed, right? But even sometimes when they would get supplies, sometimes that supplies was rancid or bad or whatever. Like, we have diaries of them getting rotten meat, and the men were so desperate they would either just cut out the rot or just cook it and hope the rot got cooked enough to where it wouldn't hurt them so bad, right? So that's the kind of desperate state that they're in here, right? So they're in really bad shape. But there are also most of them are militia, most of them are farmers. Now, granted, some of them have been in there for a year or two, but they don't really know what they're doing, right? And upgrading military efficiency and morale and discipline is a vital way for the Army's well-being to keep up, right? And the Army had been handicapped in a lot of battles because unit training was administered from various field manuals, making coordinated battle moments awkward and difficult. I mean, think about it. How much confidence are you going to have in your officers when you're like, sir, what do we do now? And he's reading a manual there in the field going, I'm not to that part of the book yet. I'm still in the introductory section, and when I get to that, I'll let you know. You're going to be like, what are we doing out here? We're going to die for this, right? So there's not a lot of confidence there, not only in the men, but in the officers and all this irregular training. Some men have better training than others, and it's just kind of a mess, right? So Washington's even despairing over this, because not only are his men just sitting there freezing, he also has nothing for them to do, which makes it even worse. So he sends a letter to Congress, and then Congress eventually he also gets a letter to Ben Franklin over there, just kind of lamenting, like saying, you know, this is what's going on. Well, to make a really long story short, what happens is that there's a guy hanging out in Paris at the time named Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. And von Steuben was a soldier in the Prussian army under Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great and his Prussian army in Europe were the best fighting force in Europe at the time, by far. There's nobody that could touch the Prussians when it came to their land army. Just nobody could touch them, right? And von Steuben was part of Frederick the Great's council, essentially. And he's sitting there in Paris, and he wants to help. And he's trying to negotiate things. Well, eventually he gets the okay to come over to America. And Ben Franklin writes him a letter of introduction, and he goes to the Continental Congress with this letter of introduction. Congress says, yes, please go help Washington. So von Steuben marches into Washington's camp with that letter from Ben Franklin and from the Congress. And Washington's like, oh, Washington knows who he is. I mean, he's von Steuben from Frederick the Great's council. So he immediately makes him something called the Acting Inspector General. That essentially what it equates to is he's the drill sergeant, is essentially what he is. He's like an elevated drill sergeant, right? And Washington says, von Steuben, you can use whatever you want. You can do whatever you need to get these men into shape. Well, von Steuben spoke very little English, if any, right? So he just started going out there and just yelling at guys in German, right? It just started like kicking them, manhandling them, getting in line, and just yelling at them in German. And of course, the soldier's like, what the hell is this? This little German guy comes in here and starts kicking me and yelling at me. What am I supposed to do, right? Well, eventually they start like understanding what he's trying to do with them, right? And he gets them every day, dawn until dusk. Every day he takes them, drills them, trains them how to be better soldiers. And he sits there and just yells at them all day, every day, right? One of the soldiers, he's probably exaggerating, but he said on a clear winter day, you could hear von Steuben yelling from a mile or two away. Now, that's probably an over-exaggeration, but it should tell you the kind of power he had over these guys, right? So he's constantly trying to drill them, train them, get them going, right? And what he does is he trains them into a fighting force, right? And he instilled in these men a newfound confidence in themselves and their ability to succeed. They realize we've been trained like the British. We can fight these guys, but we can also implement our own ways of fighting as well. And von Steuben kind of encouraged that with them. Like, this is how you fight formally, but you should also use the types of things that you're helping you hold on here, like your guerrilla type tactics, and we'll mix those in, right? So this intensive training every day was coupled with von Steuben's very forceful manner really raised the morale of the men. And morale is incredibly important when it comes to war, right? You could have the best fighters in the world, but if their morale is low, if their morale is crushed, you're not going to win. It really boosts these guys' morale. Now, as opposed to just sitting around freezing their balls off, watching their friends die, now they're out there doing something. Now they're out there doing something productive, right? And getting into war mode and how they can beat the British once and for all and secure their home. And von Steuben actually hangs around the rest of the war, and he's sent to places that Washington needs him to be, right? And so he kind of acts as a floating general for Washington. Washington's like, von Steuben, I need you here to help these guys. I need you here. I need you here with me to help with these guys here. So von Steuben hangs around, and he really helps the American army really gain their confidence back and really find out what they can do against the British. So, on June 16th, 1778, 6 months after it arrived, Washington army marches away from Valley Forge in pursuit of the British, who have now started to move around Philadelphia and who are now moving back towards New York. So an ordeal had ended here for the Americans. Now, the war would last another 5 years officially, 3 really on paper, or 3 or 5 on paper, 3 in reality. With their new French allies, their new training, a new sense of duty, the U.S. Army, the Continental Army, was ready to continue the war. But, as they say, it's always darkest before the dawn. So, let's take a look at some random things about the war that, don't really have a place here or there, but we need to kind of talk about here. And this is a good spot for it. So, let's talk about blacks in the Army, in the Continental Army. By 1779, as many as 1 in 7 Americans in Washington's own personal army were black. Some of them were freedmen, some of them were slaves. Now, at first, Washington was hesitant about enlisting blacks, right? Especially slaves. Freedmen, he was kind of, okay, maybe. But the slaves, he was really hesitant on. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that Washington was, for lack of a better term, he was a good slave owner. Now, I know you may be saying, how can somebody be a good slave owner? I understand that, right? But Washington made sure that all of his slaves were educated, right? That they could read and write, they could do complex math, things like this, right? And Washington actually trusted his slaves to run a lot of his businesses on their own. In fact, he had a couple of distilleries there in Pennsylvania that he allowed his slaves to run freely, right? So they were slaves, but they essentially had a free man's life. When Washington dies, he manumits all of his slaves. He frees all of his slaves, and he felt good about it because he knew that all of them were educated and could survive in the world, right? But the reason why he was so hesitant is because he knew that not all other slave owners were like him. And that some of these slaves, he doesn't know how they were treated. He doesn't know if they were treated well or poor. And he's afraid that some of them either might just run off or may start killing people, mad at, they run across another slave owner, or, something like that, and they murder him. So he's a little hesitant at first. However, he had heard how well an all-black regiment had fought at Bunker Hill, and that changed his mind. In fact, there was an all-black Rhode Island regiment, known as the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, composed of 33 freemen and 92 slaves. And the 92 slaves were promised freedom if they served until the end of the war. And they actually distinguished themselves in a couple of battles. And so Washington, this actually became a favorite regiment of Washington's. And he actually sent them to try to take out a British attack. But unfortunately, that Rhode Island regiment was all but wiped out by that British attack. But you had a lot of blacks fighting for American freedom, right? Now, there's obviously some arguments over historians about whether or not those slaves who survived till the end of the war actually got freedom or not. We have accounts that said that they do. We have accounts that say that they don't. And then, of course, some accounts that say, well, some did and some didn't. So that's probably more accurate. Is some definitely got their freedom, and some of them were probably kept as slaves anyway. Right? Then there's also women in the Continental Army. Even a few who saw combat. Right? Most of the time, the women were nurses or cooks or laundresses, things of that nature. Right? But every now and then, you would have one enter into the battle. Probably the most famous woman is a woman named Mary Ludwig Hayes. And her nickname was Molly Pitcher. Right? And why she was called Molly Pitcher is because she pitched in to help. So she's a pitcher, right? I don't know where the Molly came from. But she actually replaced her wounded husband and his cannon during a battle called the Battle of Monmouth in 1778. Another wife of an artilleryman, a woman by the name of Margaret Corbin, was badly wounded serving in her husband's gun crew at the Battle of Harlem Heights in 1776. Right? So, you have these women who see their husbands get shot, as opposed to going, oh my God, honey, are you okay? They're like, British bastards hurting my husband, and then they get in there and try to kill more British. It's kind of funny, right? So women they're serving there too. Then, by 1779, there are actually more Americans fighting with the British than fighting with Washington. right? And those that we call, of course, are loyalists. There were no less than 21 regiments, or about 8,000 men, that were loyal to the British Army, fighting as loyalists in the British Army. Washington's field army, his own personal army at that time in 1779, was about 8,000 or so, 7,000, right? So there's actually more loyalists fighting against Washington than there are in Washington's own army, right? And every now and then I get the question, well, what happened to the loyalists after the war? I will say, not good things. A lot of loyalists flee to Canada at the end. Some flee back to Britain. Some stay. Now, the ones that stay have a rough time. Let's put it that way. A lot of them have their land taken away. Some of them are actually killed. Some of them are just harassed for the rest of their lives. It was not a good life for loyalists if they decided to stay. That's why many fled to Canada or to England.